Imagine waking up one morning and realizing your life savings couldn't even buy you a loaf of bread. Your wallet, once a symbol of security, now feels like a cruel joke. You carry cash in baskets, not wallets. Your salary comes twice a day, not once a month. And you run from your factory to the bakery before the price of bread doubles by sunset. In 1923, in the heart of Europe, this was no nightmare, it was reality. The German mark was once among the strongest currencies in the world. But within just a few short years, it became worth less than the paper it was printed on. And out of this chaos, out of hunger, fear, and betrayal, rose a man who promised to make Germany great again. But how did an empire collapse into madness so fast? How could a modern, educated, industrial nation, the land of Goethe, Beethoven, and Einstein, destroy its own money, and in doing so pave the way for Adolf Hitler? The truth is not just about bad economics. It's about pride. It's about revenge. It's about what happens when a nation loses faith, not just in its government but in value itself. This is the story of Weimar Germany, the inflation that didn't just bankrupt a nation. It fed a dictator. The wound that wouldn't heal. The year is 1918. The guns of the First World War have finally fallen silent. Germany, once a mighty empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II, stands defeated. For 4 years, the nation had poured everything into the war. Men, machines, money. The cost? Over 2 million German soldiers dead, millions more wounded or missing. Cities were exhausted, resources drained, morale shattered. But the worst blow was still to come, not from bullets but from paper. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, didn't just end the war, it branded Germany as the villain of Europe. Under the treaty, Germany was forced to accept war guilt, full responsibility for the conflict, and pay reparations so massive, they were almost impossible to comprehend. The sum, 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion US dollars at the time. Adjusted for today, that's nearly $500 billion. It was, in short, a death sentence for the German economy. But here's where the tragedy begins. Germany didn't have that kind of money. It couldn't just conjure gold out of thin air. So, the government did something desperate, something that would change history. They began to print. A dangerous idea. At first, the logic seemed simple. Printing money, after all, could help pay debts, rebuild cities, and restart the economy. The government argued, we owe money in gold marks, but we can create paper marks. A temporary solution, they said. Just until the economy recovers. But there was one fatal misunderstanding. You can't print wealth. You can only print paper. And every new note that rolled off the presses made every other mark worth a little less. Still, to the politicians of the newly formed Weimar Republic, this wasn't economics. It was politics. Because Germany wasn't just broke. It was humiliated. Crowds filled the streets shouting, "Down with Versailles." Newspapers called it the Diktat, the dictation of foreign powers. To the average German, reparations weren't just payments. They were a chain, forged by Britain and France, to keep Germany weak forever. So, when the Weimar government began quietly inflating the currency, many saw it as a subtle act of rebellion. A way to pay the Allies back, with worthless money. In Berlin, the presses began to roar. The Reichsbank printed mark notes faster than any mint in history. By 1920, there were 66 billion marks in circulation. By 1922, over 400 billion. And by late 1923, that number would rise to over 400 trillion. It started slowly, then spiraled beyond control. The illusion of stability. For a brief moment it seemed to work. Factories reopened. Unemployment dropped. The mark, though weaker, still functioned. Foreign investors, especially from America, poured money into German industry betting on recovery. But beneath the surface the foundations were cracking. The prices of basic goods began to creep upward, then surge. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost 250 marks by 1922. The mark's value against the dollar collapsed. 1914. 4 marks equals 1 US dollar. 1922, 320 marks equals 1 US dollar. Late 1923, 4.2 trillion marks equals 1 US dollar. The middle class, once the backbone of German society, began to vanish. People who had saved all their lives found their savings evaporated overnight. A retired teacher's pension could no longer buy a single egg. Families burned banknotes in stoves, because they were cheaper than firewood. One eyewitness recalled, "We would rush to spend our wages the moment we received them. Prices would rise between the time we got paid and the time we got to the store." Money had lost its meaning. And when money dies, trust dies with it. The spiral of madness. But what made this spiral unstoppable wasn't just economics, it was psychology. Once people believe that money will lose value tomorrow, they stop saving and start hoarding goods instead. Farmers refused to sell grain for cash that would be worthless by the weekend. Cities starved while the countryside held food hostage. Prices doubled, then quadrupled, every few days. Factories tried to pay workers twice a day just so they could spend their wages before prices rose again. Some towns created local currencies. Others bartered, bread for coal, shoes for potatoes. The German economy was no longer an economy. It was chaos. And into that chaos stepped opportunists, speculators, profiteers, and extremists, promising order. The political earthquake. As the economy disintegrated, politics followed. Faith in democracy collapsed as fast as the mark itself. To many Germans, the Weimar Republic seemed weak, a puppet of foreign powers. Newspapers mocked its leaders as November criminals, blaming them for surrendering in 1918 and signing Versailles. And the people, hungry, humiliated, desperate, began searching for someone to blame. Communists blamed the bankers and capitalists. Nationalists blamed the Jews and foreign powers. Ordinary citizens blamed everyone. Riots broke out in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich. Extremist groups formed militias. The political center, that fragile space between left and right, collapsed. And in that vacuum, a radical fringe movement began to rise. A movement that promised to restore pride, to punish the traitors, and to make Germany strong again. Its leader was a failed artist and soldier from Austria, a man named Adolf Hitler. The brewing storm. At this point, few took Hitler seriously. He was just another angry nationalist shouting in Munich beer halls. But the timing, the economic despair, was his greatest ally. Because inflation doesn't just destroy savings. It destroys faith. Faith in money. Faith in institutions. Faith in democracy itself. And when people lose faith, they look for saviors. Hitler's message was simple. Germany had been betrayed, by the weak politicians in Berlin, by the foreign powers in Paris, and by the Jews who controlled the banks. These were lies, but to a starving nation they sounded like truth. By 1923, as inflation reached its zenith, Hitler made his first move, the infamous beer hall putsch, an attempted coup to seize power in Munich. It failed. He was arrested, imprisoned, and briefly forgotten. But the seeds had been planted. The inflation that began as a desperate financial trick had destroyed the economic order and fertilized the soil for dictatorship. Hyperinflation didn't just empty wallets. It hollowed out a nation's soul. When money ceases to have meaning, so does morality. And in that void, the unthinkable becomes possible. The year everything collapsed. The year was 1923, the year money truly died. The German mark was no longer a currency. It was a curse. Every morning, shopkeepers had to raise their prices before opening. By afternoon, they raised them again. By evening, they ran out of chalk to update the numbers on their boards. The government kept printing, not millions, not billions, but trillions of marks every day. Entire trainloads of banknotes left the Reichsbank to feed a country drowning in its own paper. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A cup of coffee? 15 billion. And a single postage stamp? 1 billion marks. The newspapers joked that it was cheaper to burn marks than buy coal. But nobody was laughing anymore. One worker recalled. We were paid at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. every day. Our wives waited outside the factory gates to grab the money and run to the market before prices rose again. The collapse of everyday life. Hyperinflation didn't just break the economy, it broke the rhythm of life. Shops refused to accept paper money. Barter became the new currency. Shoes for potatoes. A piano for a sack of coal. Gold rings for loaves of bread. Farmers hoarded their crops, unwilling to trade food for worthless marks. Cities began to starve. Civil servants, teachers, and doctors, once pillars of society, were reduced to beggars. Imagine being a professor, once respected, now standing on a corner trying to sell your family's furniture for a few meals. The middle class, the heart of any stable democracy, was annihilated. And with it, Germany's fragile belief in order, fairness, and democracy itself. The politics of desperation. As chaos spread, so did rage. The Weimar government, helpless to control the economy, saw its authority crumble. Political violence became part of daily life. Communist uprisings erupted in Saxony and Hamburg. Right-wing militias clashed with socialist workers in the streets. Gunfire echoed through cities once filled with music. The people had stopped arguing about policy. Now they just wanted someone to take control. And when people stop believing in law, they start believing in force. Both the left and the right exploited the chaos. The communists promised equality through revolution. The nationalists promised pride through vengeance. In between, democracy drowned. And at the center of it all, a small radical party in Munich was quietly growing louder, led by a man who had learned the power of emotion, of anger, and of propaganda, Adolf Hitler. The Beer Hall Putsch. In November 1923, as the mark hit its lowest point and the nation teetered on collapse, Hitler saw his chance. He and his followers stormed a beer hall in Munich where Bavarian leaders were meeting. Armed with pistols, he declared the formation of a new national government. It was chaotic. It was reckless. It was a failure. The coup collapsed within hours. Police fired into the crowd. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. But here's the paradox. His failure would become his greatest victory. Because while the hyperinflation ended, the anger it left behind did not. The sudden miracle. As the chaos peaked, the Weimar government made one last desperate move, and somehow, miraculously, it worked. In late 1923, a new currency was introduced, the Rentenmark. One Rentenmark was worth 1 trillion old paper marks. The secret was trust. This new currency wasn't backed by gold, it was backed by land and industry. Essentially, by the promise of future productivity. The printing presses slowed. The madness paused. Prices stabilized. For the first time in years, Germany could breathe again. Foreign investors cautiously returned. Life, though fragile, began to resemble normality. But the damage, psychological, social, moral, was irreversible. What the numbers can't tell. To outsiders, the crisis had ended. But inside Germany, something darker was brewing. Millions of ordinary people had learned a painful truth. The state could not protect them. Their savings were gone. Their dignity destroyed. Their faith in democracy shattered. They didn't blame the printing presses or bad economics. They blamed the system. They blamed the politicians in Berlin, the bankers in Frankfurt, the allies in Paris, and, tragically, the Jews whom Nazi propaganda falsely portrayed as profiteers of Germany's suffering. It was a lie. But lies don't need to be true, they just need to feel true. Hitler's prison years. While in prison for his failed coup, Hitler began writing the book that would define his ideology, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Inside, he transformed economic despair into political rage. He argued that Germany's collapse was not an accident, but a betrayal. That the Weimar Republic was a tool of foreign bankers. That the only way to restore strength was through dictatorship, unity, and purity. He turned the story of inflation, a financial catastrophe, into a moral crusade. And when he left prison less than a year later, he was no longer just a failed revolutionary. He was a myth. A man with a story that millions of angry, desperate Germans were ready to believe. The calm before the storm. By the mid-1920s, Germany entered what historians call the Golden Twenties. The economy recovered. Foreign loans, especially from America, poured in. Berlin became a hub of art, music, and modern life. To the world it looked like a comeback story. But underneath, the scars of hyperinflation were still fresh. Every German remembered the chaos, The hunger, the humiliation, the fear of losing everything overnight. It created a psychological trauma, a national paranoia about inflation that would haunt Germany for generations. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929, those old fears resurfaced instantly. Factories closed again. Unemployment soared. And once more Germans searched for a savior. This time they didn't choose democracy. They chose the man who promised to never let Germany be humiliated again. They chose Hitler. The invisible chain of cause and effect. It's tempting to think hyperinflation and dictatorship are separate events, but in truth, one fed the other. When money loses its value, people lose their sense of control. When people lose control, they seek someone who promises certainty. And certainty, in desperate times, often wears the mask of tyranny. The printing press that once tried to save Germany from debt had instead printed desperation. And desperation printed dictatorship. By destroying faith in the mark, Weimar Germany had destroyed faith in the state. And out of that vacuum rose the most dangerous illusion of all, the illusion of a strong man who could restore order. The fallout and the monster it fed. From ashes to iron. The Weimar Republic was meant to be Germany's rebirth, democracy rising from the ashes of empire. But by the early 1930s, it was a ghost. The scars of hyperinflation never faded. The money might have stabilized, but the memory of worthlessness lingered, buried deep in the national psyche. Ask anyone who lived through 1923 and they would tell you, it's not the hunger you remember most. It's the fear. Fear that the number in your hand, your paycheck, your savings, could vanish before sunrise. That fear defined a generation. And fear is the most powerful political weapon ever invented. Then came 1929. The Great Depression. American loans that had propped up Germany's fragile recovery were called back. Banks collapsed. Factories shut down. Millions were unemployed once more. The same streets that had seen hunger in 1923 now saw it again, but this time, people remembered who had promised to protect them from chaos. And his name was Adolf Hitler. The resurrection of a demagogue. After his release from prison, Hitler had spent years reorganizing his movement. He traded rebellion for strategy. He learned to speak the language of despair, not as a soldier but as a savior. He told Germans what they wanted to hear. That the humiliation of Versailles would end. That the traitors of Weimar would be punished. That inflation, poverty, and hunger would never return, if only they trusted him. He didn't talk about economics. He talked about emotion, pride, revenge, destiny. And after years of inflation, those emotions were worth more than gold. By 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. By 1934, democracy was gone. The Weimar Republic, the first German experiment with freedom, was officially dead. But the seeds of its death had been sown years earlier, not by politics but by printing presses. How inflation shaped the Third Reich. It's easy to see the Weimar inflation as a financial tragedy. But it was far more than that, it was a moral and psychological one. The hyperinflation didn't just ruin the economy, it taught people that money was meaningless and trust was futile. It erased the idea that the state could protect the ordinary citizen. So, when Hitler began to rebuild Germany's economy, through rearmament, propaganda, and control, people were willing to obey. They didn't want freedom. They wanted stability. And that desire, that exhaustion from chaos, made dictatorship not just acceptable but desirable. Hyperinflation didn't create Hitler. But it created the conditions where Hitler could thrive. A society stripped of trust is like dry wood, it only takes one spark to ignite it. The cost of forgetting. After the Second World War, economists around the world studied Weimar Germany's collapse like a crime scene. They dissected every chart, every policy, every bank decision, to understand how a modern nation could commit economic suicide. But the lessons went beyond numbers. The Weimar tragedy became a warning etched into the DNA of modern finance. In Germany to this day, the word inflation still carries the weight of trauma. It's why post-war Germany built the Bundesbank, an independent central bank obsessed with stability. It's why the European Central Bank, modeled after it, still prioritizes inflation control above all else. Because for Germans, inflation isn't just a statistic. It's the ghost of their democracy. the modern parallels. But what if I told you, the same forces that destroyed Weimar are whispering again today? Across the world, nations are printing money at record levels. Global debt has surpassed $300 trillion. Inflation, once dismissed as a relic of the past, has returned, quietly eroding trust in currencies everywhere. In 2020 and 2021 alone, more than 20% of all US dollars in existence were created, in less than 2 years. Central banks call it quantitative easing. But history has another word for it: temptation. Because printing money feels easy, until faith breaks. And once faith breaks, there's no printing press large enough to restore it. Of course, today's world isn't Weimar. Our systems are more complex, our economies more globalized. But the psychology, the human element, hasn't changed. People still crave security. They still panic when prices rise. And when fear spreads, they still search for strong voices promising order. The danger isn't inflation alone. It's what inflation does to democracy. When citizens lose faith in money, they often lose faith in the institutions that manage it. And that's when demagogues, in every era, under every banner, find their opportunity. The echo of history. Look around the world today. Political polarization is rising. Economic inequality is widening. Public trust in government and media is collapsing. Each of these symptoms echoes Weimar's decline. It starts with frustration. It grows with fear. And it ends with a desperate cry, "Someone please fix it." But history teaches a cruel truth. The people who promise to fix everything are often the ones who break it beyond repair. The human lesson. The story of Weimar Germany is not just about inflation. It's about human nature. When wealth vanishes overnight, morality becomes negotiable. When survival becomes the goal, truth becomes irrelevant. And when fear replaces faith, even the most civilized society can descend into madness. The same people who once debated philosophy and art in Berlin's cafes would later march under the banner of tyranny, not because they were evil, but because they were broken. Money can be printed, but trust, once lost, may never return. 3 takeaways. 1. Inflation is not just numbers, it's psychology. Once people stop believing their money has value, the economy collapses from the inside out. 2. Desperation breeds extremism. Economic chaos doesn't automatically create dictators, but it creates the soil where they grow. 3. History repeats when memory fades. Every generation thinks, it can't happen here. So did the Germans of 1919. So do many today. The warning. So remember this. The fall of Weimar Germany didn't begin with war or hate. It began with paper. With the belief that a government could print prosperity. With the illusion that debt could disappear if you just ignored it long enough. It began with ordinary people, just like us, trusting that someone else would handle the crisis. But no one did. And when the mark died, democracy died with it. The Weimar Republic printed money to escape the past, and in doing so, printed the future it feared most. Today, as nations again test the limits of trust and debt, perhaps the question isn't whether history will repeat, but whether we'll recognize it when it does. Because when money dies, something far greater dies with it. If you found this story thought-provoking, share it. Because the greatest defense against repeating history is remembering it. And for more untold financial mysteries that shape the world, subscribe to World Financial Mysteries.